The conference room fell silent the moment I twisted the ring on my finger. I hadn't meant to draw attention to it. It was just a nervous habit, something I'd done since I was a child. But when Marcus Thornfield, CEO of Thornfield Industries and the most powerful man in architectural innovation, locked eyes on that simple silver band, his face drained of all color. "Where did you get that?" His voice cracked. The entire board of trustees turned to look at me. I was 24 years old, a graduate student at Callaway Institute of Architecture, presenting my thesis on sustainable urban design to a panel that included the university's biggest donors. This was supposed to be my moment, my breakthrough. Instead, I was frozen under the gaze of a man who looked like he'd seen a ghost. It was my grandfather's, I managed to say. Marcus stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. What was his name? Jonathan Hayes. The name felt heavy in my mouth. It always did. The room erupted in whispers. Dean Morrison shot me a warning look, but Marcus wasn't finished. He stepped closer, his hands trembling as he reached toward me, then stopped himself. May I see it? I should have said no, should have protected what little I had left of the man who raised me. But something in Marcus's eyes, a desperate, aching familiarity, made me slide the ring off my finger. The moment it touched his palm, a single tear rolled down his cheek. "God forgive me," he whispered. "I thought you were all gone. I was 7 when my grandfather died." I remember the funeral, a small, quiet affair with almost no attendees. Just me, my mother, and 3 old men in identical gray suits who stood at a distance watching. They never approached us, never offered condolences. They simply observed. My mother never spoke about them. And when I asked about my grandfather's work, about why he had a workshop filled with blueprints and strange symbols carved into wooden boxes, she would only say, "Your grandfather was brilliant, and brilliance comes with secrets." The ring was the only thing she let me keep. It was simple sterling silver, no gemstones, just an engraved symbol on the inside. A compass rose intertwined with the letter V. I wore it every day, a talisman against a world that felt too big and too indifferent. When I got into Callaway Institute at 22, I thought I was honoring his memory, becoming the architect he trained me to be during those childhood afternoons in his workshop, where he taught me to see buildings not as structures, but as stories. I never imagined that ring would unlock a door I didn't know existed. Back in the conference room, Marcus handed the ring back to me with shaking hands. "We need to talk," he said quietly. "Alone," Dean Morrison interjected. "Mr. Thornfield, Miss Hayes still has her presentation to complete. Reschedule it." Marcus's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "This is more important." The dean's mouth opened, then closed. "You didn't argue with a man who donated $30 million to the university's expansion fund." 5 minutes later, I sat across from Marcus in a private study, the ring back on my finger, my heart hammering against my ribs. "That ring," Marcus began, his voice barely above a whisper, "belonged to one of the founding members of something we called the Vanguard Society, a group of 12 architects, engineers, and designers who came together 40 years ago with a single mission: to preserve the knowledge and techniques that were being erased by corporate greed and academic politics." I stared at him. "My grandfather was part of a secret society?" "Not just part of it. Jonathan Hayes was our leader." Marcus's eyes glistened. "He was the one who made us swear an oath to protect each other, to preserve our work, to pass on what we knew to those who deserved it. That ring was his seal of authority." My throat tightened. "Then why did he die alone? Why was his funeral empty?" Marcus looked away. "Because I failed him." We all did. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. 3 years before Jonathan died, the society fractured. There was a betrayal. One of our own tried to sell our research to Grandeur Corp. When Jonathan confronted him, the man retaliated. He went to the university, to the licensing boards, claimed our methods were unethical, our designs stolen. Within 6 months, every one of us was blacklisted. I felt something cold settle in my chest. "And you just let it happen?" We were cowards, Marcus said simply. We scattered, went underground, changed our names, our work. Jonathan refused. He kept fighting, kept teaching, kept building, and because of that, they destroyed him completely. His reputation, his career, his legacy. He met my eyes. I vowed to protect him forever, and I abandoned him when he needed me most. I looked down at the ring, at the symbol I'd worn for 17 years without understanding its meaning. Who was my grandfather really? I asked. Marcus's expression shifted, something between hope and fear. He was the greatest architect of his generation. And if you're wearing that ring, then you're the one he chose to continue his work. My grandfather's workshop had been in the basement of our old house in Portland. After he died, my mother sold the property, but not before packing away his belongings into storage boxes I'd never been allowed to open. Until now. I stood in the climate-controlled storage unit at midnight, my phone flashlight cutting through the darkness as I tore through boxes labeled Jonathan Archive blueprints. Hundreds of them, designs for buildings I'd never seen, structures that seemed to defy physics and convention, bridges that curved like musical notes, libraries with spiral staircases that created natural acoustic amplification, housing developments designed to maximize sunlight and community interaction, and on every single blueprint, in the bottom right corner, the Vanguard symbol. But it was the leather journal that stopped me cold. Inside, in my grandfather's familiar slanted handwriting, "To whoever inherits this work, know that you carry not just my legacy, but the legacy of 12 visionaries who dared to imagine a world where architecture served humanity, not profit." The Vanguard Society was born from a simple truth, that beauty, function, and sustainability are not luxuries, but necessities. We were silenced, but we were never wrong. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. Names, 12 names, each with a photograph and a specialty. Jonathan Hayes, Sustainable Urban Design. My grandfather, Marcus Thornfield, Industrial Architecture. Eleanor Voss, Historical Preservation. David Chen, Structural Engineering. Sarah Okafor, Environmental Design, and 7 more. Each member had created something revolutionary, and each had been systematically discredited. At the back of the journal, a folded letter. "If you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have found what I left behind." The Vanguard was betrayed by someone we trusted. I never discovered who, but I know this: our work was too important to die with us. Find the others, rebuild what we lost, and remember, institutions forget, but legacies don't. I clutched the journal to my chest, tears streaming down my face. My grandfather hadn't just been brilliant, he'd been dangerous. Dangerous to an industry built on cutting corners, on prioritizing profit over people, on making architecture a luxury instead of a right. And now, 17 years after his death, I was holding proof. Callaway Institute of Architecture was one of the most prestigious programs in the country. It was also one of the most rigid. Students were expected to follow established methodologies, to design within accepted parameters, to never question the curriculum. Innovation was encouraged, but only within very specific boundaries. I'd always chafed against those boundaries. Now I understood why. The morning after my discovery, I walked into Dean Morrison's office with my grandfather's journal. "I need access to the restricted archives," I said without preamble. Dean Morrison looked up from his desk, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Hayes, I trust you've recovered from yesterday's disruption? I need to research the Vanguard Society." His pen stilled. "I'm not familiar with don't." My voice was sharper than I intended. Marcus Thornfield recognized my ring. My grandfather was Jonathan Hayes, one of the founding members. "And I know the university has records." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "Some histories are better left buried." Why? Because they're embarrassing? Because they expose how this institution treats visionaries? Because they're irrelevant? Dean Morrison stood, his voice hardening. "Your grandfather was a talented man who made poor choices. The Vanguard Society was investigated and found to have violated multiple ethical standards. Their methods were unsound, Their claims unsubstantiated. That's a lie. It's documented fact, Miss Hayes. He opened a drawer, pulled out a thin file, and slid it across the desk. See for yourself. I opened it with shaking hands. Inside, a formal complaint filed 30 years ago by Dr. Gerald Ashford, then a junior member of Callaway's architecture faculty, claiming that the Vanguard Society had stolen research, fabricated data, and endangered students with experimental building techniques. The complaint had been endorsed by the university president, the licensing board, and 3 major architecture firms. Every single one of the Vanguard members had been stripped of their credentials. Dr. Ashford, I said slowly, is now the head of Callaway's Architectural Ethics Board, isn't he? D. Morrison's expression tightened. He's a respected member of this institution. He's the one who destroyed them. He protected this university's reputation. I looked down at the file, at the lies typed neatly onto official letterhead, and felt something inside me crystallize. I'm going to prove he was wrong, I said quietly. Dean Morrison sighed. Miss Hayes, I strongly advise you to focus on your thesis and leave the past alone. I stood, clutching my grandfather's journal. My thesis is the past. It's about how we've forgotten that architecture is supposed to serve people, not corporations. And I'm going to use my grandfather's work to prove it. Then you're making a grave mistake. I met his eyes. Or maybe I'm finally making the right one. It wasn't just a ring. It was a key. That night, I noticed something I'd missed before, a tiny seam along the inner band. When I twisted it, the ring opened, revealing a hollow interior. Inside, a folded piece of paper, impossibly thin, with an address written in faded ink. 1247 Ashwood Lane, basement, east wall. I plugged the address into my phone. It was the old Callaway Institute Library, the original building, abandoned 15 years ago when the new facility opened. And according to the university's archived blueprints, there was no basement, which meant my grandfather had hidden something there that the university didn't know existed. Breaking into a condemned building was not part of my usual Tuesday night routine, but neither was discovering that my dead grandfather had been part of a secret society of architectural revolutionaries. The old Callaway Library stood at the edge of campus, behind a chain-link fence covered in "No Trespassing" signs. The windows were boarded up, the doors padlocked. But I'd been exploring forbidden corners of this campus since my first year. I knew how to get inside. The basement entrance was hidden behind a false panel in the building's foundation, exactly where my grandfather's note said it would be. I descended into darkness, my phone flashlight revealing walls covered in dust and graffiti. But when I reached the east wall and pressed against a section of brick marked with a faint Vanguard symbol, it swung inward. A hidden room, and inside, a complete archive. Blueprints pinned to corkboards, models built from wood and wire, photographs of buildings I'd never seen. And in the center of it all, a conference table with 12 chairs, 11 empty, one with a name placard still in place. Jonathan Hayes, founder. I walked slowly through the space, my heart in my throat. This was their headquarters, the place where they'd met, planned, created. Everything the university claimed didn't exist was right here, preserved like a time capsule. And then I saw it, a filing cabinet labeled Project Cornerstone. Inside were documents detailing a revolutionary design for low-income housing buildings that cost half the standard rate to construct, used entirely sustainable materials, and created community spaces that reduce crime and increase social cohesion by 40%. The Vanguard had tested the design in 3 cities. The results were extraordinary. And according to the notes, they presented it to Callaway Institute's Board of Trustees 30 years ago, asking for institutional support to scale the project nationwide. The proposal had been rejected, not because it didn't work, but because it threatened the profit margins of the construction companies that funded the university. 3 weeks after the rejection, Dr. Gerald Ashford filed his complaint. I stood in that underground room, surrounded by proof of everything my grandfather had fought for, and made a decision. I was going to expose the truth, not quietly, not diplomatically, at the university's annual architecture gala, in front of everyone. The architecture gala was Callaway's biggest event of the year, a black tie fundraiser attended by donors, faculty, alumni, and corporate partners. Students were invited to present their thesis projects to potential employers. I'd been planning to present my sustainable urban design work. Instead, I rebuilt Project Cornerstone. I spent 3 weeks recreating the Vanguard's low-income housing model using modern materials and updated code standards. I compiled the original test data. I prepared a presentation that showed irrefutably that this design worked and that the university had buried it for 30 years. The night of the gala, I wore my grandfather's ring on a chain around my neck and walked into the marble-floored ballroom with my presentation loaded and ready. Dean Morrison spotted me immediately. "Miss Hayes, I trust your presentation will be appropriate?" "It'll be honest," I said. He frowned but said nothing. When my turn came, I stepped up to the podium, looked out at the sea of tuxedos and evening gowns, and began. "Good evening. My name is Elena Hayes, and I'm here to talk about the greatest architectural innovation Callaway Institute ever tried to bury." The room went still. I clicked to the first slide, a photograph of the Vanguard Society, all 12 members standing in front of the old library. 30 years ago, a group of visionaries created a housing design that could have changed the world. It was affordable, sustainable, and proven to work. The university rejected it not because it was flawed, but because it wasn't profitable. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dean Morrison stood, his face red. "Miss Hayes, this is highly inappropriate. I have the original blueprints. I have the test data. I have everything they tried to erase." I clicked through slides showing the Vanguard's work, the results, the deliberate suppression. And then I looked directly at the table where Dr. Gerald Ashford sat, his expression frozen. "And I have proof that the man who destroyed them did it to protect corporate interests, not ethical standards." The room erupted. Ashford shot to his feet. "This is slander." "Security, it's truth." I pulled out my grandfather's journal, held it up. "And it's all documented." Marcus Thornfield, seated near the back, stood slowly. Our eyes met across the room. And then he began to applaud. One person, then another, and another. Not everyone, but enough. Enough to make it clear that this wasn't over. Afterward, in the chaos of arguments and journalists and security trying to escort me out, Marcus caught my arm. "That was reckless," he said. "It was necessary." He studied my face, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a ring identical to mine. 12 founders, he said quietly. 12 rings. I stared at the silver band in his palm, and somehow, I breathed. "You kept yours, we all did. We were just too afraid to wear them." He pressed the ring into my hand. "But you're not afraid, are you?" I closed my fingers around both rings. "Not anymore." They suspended me the next morning, pending an investigation into allegations of academic misconduct and unauthorized use of university property, Dean Morrison said, his voice clipped. I sat in his office, my grandfather's journal confiscated, my thesis presentation deleted from the university's servers. "You broke into a condemned building. You stole archival materials. You made serious accusations without evidence." "I have evidence." "You took it. What you have," he said coldly, "is the delusional conspiracy theories of a disgraced architect and the misguided loyalty of his granddaughter." I wanted to scream, to flip his desk, to demand justice. Instead, I stood calmly. "Then I'll get more evidence. Miss Hayes, you can suspend me. You can confiscate my grandfather's work. But you can't erase what I know." I met his eyes. "And you can't stop me from talking to the people who were there." His expression flickered. "Just for a moment." "Fear. Stay away from former faculty," he warned, which told me exactly what I needed to do. Marcus gave me the list. 11 names, 11 addresses. "Some of them are dead," he said as we sat in his car outside my apartment. Some won't talk to you. Some have spent 30 years trying to forget the Vanguard ever existed, but some might remember, I said. He nodded. 3 are still in the area. Eleanor Voss teaches art history at Portland Community College. David Chen runs a small structural engineering firm downtown. And Sarah Okafor. He hesitated. Sarah never stopped fighting. She's been trying to expose what happened for decades. No one listens. They'll listen now, I said. Maybe. Marcus handed me a worn business card. Or maybe you'll just ruin your life like we ruined ours. I looked at the card, Sarah Okafor, environmental design consultant, and tucked it into my pocket. My grandfather didn't raise me to play it safe. Sarah Okafor lived in a small house in southeast Portland, surrounded by a garden that looked like controlled chaos, native plants, rain gardens, composting systems, all integrated into a design that was as beautiful as it was functional. She answered the door in paint-stained overalls, her silver hair pulled back in a braid. You're Jonathan's granddaughter, she said immediately. How did you have his eyes? And his stubbornness. She stepped aside. Come in. We have a lot to talk about. Her living room was a shrine to the Vanguard. Blueprints on the walls, photographs, newspaper clippings, a corkboard covered in red string connecting names and dates like a detective's murder board. I never stopped investigating, Sarah said, handing me tea. Everyone else moved on, tried to rebuild their lives. But I needed to know who betrayed us, and did you find out? She pointed to the corkboard. It wasn't one person, it was a system. I stepped closer, reading the connections she'd mapped out. Dr. Gerald Ashford had filed the complaint, but he'd been pressured by Chancellor Rebecca Winters, who'd been pressured by Grandeur Corporation's CEO, who'd been losing contracts to buildings designed using Vanguard methods. They didn't just want to discredit us, Sarah explained. They wanted to monopolize architectural innovation. If the Vanguard succeeded, it would have proven that ethical, sustainable design was not only possible but profitable, and corporations like Grandeur would have lost their stranglehold on the industry, so they destroyed you preemptively. Exactly. Sarah pulled out a box of documents. I've spent 30 years collecting evidence, emails, financial records, testimonies from people who were paid to lie about our work, but no one will publish it. No university will review it. The moment I mentioned the Vanguard, doors close, I thought of my grandfather's journal confiscated, of my suspension, of Dee Morrison's warning. They're still protecting the lie, I said. Of course they are, because admitting the truth means admitting they destroyed 12 lives and 30 years of innovation for profit. Sarah met my eyes. Are you ready for that fight? I don't have a choice. She smiled a fierce, warrior's smile. Good, because neither do I. Within 2 days, Sarah had gathered the remaining Vanguard members. We met in the old library basement, in the hidden room my grandfather had created. Marcus, Sarah, Eleanor Voss, a tiny woman with sharp eyes and sharper words, David Chen, quiet and watchful, and 4 others who'd driven from California, Arizona, New Mexico, all of them wearing their rings for the first time in 30 years. 8 of the original 12. The others were dead. I thought we were done, Eleanor said, looking around the table. I thought we'd agreed to let it go. Jonathan never let it go, Marcus said quietly. And now his granddaughter is asking us to finish what we started. All eyes turned to me. I stood, my grandfather's ring heavy on my finger. I'm not asking you to fight, I said. I'm asking you to be remembered, to let people know what you created, to prove that you were right. And how exactly do you plan to do that? David asked. I pulled out my phone, opened the recording I'd made of my gala presentation, the one the university had deleted. I'm going to publish everything, the blueprints, the test data, the evidence of corporate manipulation. All of it. They'll bury you, Eleanor warned. Probably. But they can't bury all of us. Sarah leaned forward. What do you need? Your stories, your designs, your proof that the Vanguard wasn't a conspiracy, it was a movement. Silence. Then slowly, Marcus reached into his bag and pulled out a folder. I kept everything, he said. Every blueprint, every note, every piece of research they told me to destroy. One by one, the others did the same. By the end of the night, the table was covered in 30 years of silenced innovation, and we were no longer victims. We were witnesses. 3 days later, I stood outside Dr. Gerald Ashford's office. I'd requested a meeting. He'd agreed, probably expecting me to beg for reinstatement. Instead, I walked in with a briefcase full of evidence and Sarah Okafor at my side. Dr. Ashford, I said pleasantly, we need to discuss your complaint against the Vanguard Society. His expression hardened. I have nothing to say to you, that's fine. Because we have plenty to say, Sarah opened the briefcase, pulled out financial records. Starting with the $50,000 payment you received from Grandeur Corporation 1 week before you filed your complaint, the color drained from his face, followed by your appointment to the ethics board, funded by a Grandeur grant, your keynote speaking fees paid by Grandeur subsidiaries, your consulting contracts. This is harassment, he said, reaching for his phone. This is accountability, I said. You destroyed 12 lives to protect corporate profit, and we can prove it. No one will believe you. Maybe not. I pulled out my phone, but they'll definitely read about it. I showed him the screen, an article draft, ready to publish, documenting everything. The Vanguard, the suppression, the payments, the systematic erasure of innovation. You can't, I can, and I will. Unless what? Sarah leaned forward. Unless you publicly admit what you did. Unless you help us clear the Vanguard's name. Unless you make this right. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he laughed bitter and hollow. You think anyone cares about a group of idealistic architects from 30 years ago? You think the university will suddenly admit fault? You're delusional. I stood. Then you've made your choice. Wait, but we were already walking out. Behind us, I heard him collapse into his chair, and for the first time in 30 years, I think he understood what it felt like to be afraid. The article published on a Thursday morning. By noon, my phone had exploded. Messages from students, faculty, journalists, alumni demanding investigations, corporate partners threatening to pull funding. The university issued a statement within hours. Callaway Institute categorically denies any wrongdoing and stands by its historical decisions regarding the disbanded Vanguard Society. Ms. Hayes's claims are currently under review. Translation. They were circling the wagons, but something else happened too. Students started wearing paper rings with the Vanguard symbol. Architecture forums lit up with discussions about Project Cornerstone. A dozen universities reached out asking for the Vanguard's original research, and a small, prestigious journal called Ethical Architecture Quarterly asked to publish my grandfather's work, not as history, as active methodology. We were winning. My suspension became permanent expulsion 2 weeks later. Dean Morrison called me into his office one final time. You've left us no choice, he said. Your actions have damaged this institution's reputation, compromised our relationships with key partners, and violated multiple codes of conduct. I exposed the truth. You destroyed your future. He slid a document across the desk. Sign this non-disclosure agreement. Agree never to speak publicly about the Vanguard or Callaway Institute again, and we'll allow you to transfer your credits to another program. Refuse, and you'll be blacklisted from every accredited architecture school in the country. I looked at the document, at the line where my signature would erase everything my grandfather fought for, and I laughed. You really don't understand, do you? Dean Morrison frowned. Understand what? I don't need Callaway anymore. I stood. Because the Vanguard is being rebuilt, and this time, you can't stop it. Ms. Hayes, keep your NDA. Keep your blacklist. Keep your corporate funding and your ethical compromises. I walked to the door, then turned back. Because in 10 years, when students study architecture history, they won't remember Callaway Institute's endowment or your donor plaques. They'll remember the people you tried to erase, and they'll know exactly why you did it. I left without signing anything. The next 6 months were chaos. Sarah and I founded the Vanguard Institute, not a university, but an open-source research collective dedicated to preserving and expanding the original members' work. Marcus donated his entire archive. Eleanor created a digital museum. David began teaching free workshops on ethical structural design. We worked out of Sarah's house, funded by small donations and the occasional grant from organizations that believed in what we were doing. And slowly, students began to find us. Not just architecture students, engineers, urban planners, environmentalists, people who'd read the article, seen the blueprints, and realized they'd been taught a sanitized version of their field's history. "You're creating exactly what they feared," Marcus told me one afternoon as we organized files in Sarah's garage-turned-office. "What's that?" "An alternative. A place where innovation isn't controlled by profit," he smiled. "Jonathan would be proud." Dr. Gerald Ashford resigned quietly that fall. No announcement, no explanation, just a one-line notice in the faculty newsletter. But we knew why. Because 3 of Grandeur Corporation's board members had also resigned, facing federal investigations into bribery and contract manipulation. Because Chancellor Rebecca Winters had been forced into early retirement after emails surfaced showing she'd knowingly suppressed research that contradicted corporate interests. Because the system that protected them was finally, slowly, cracking. 5 years later, I stood in front of a building that shouldn't exist. Project Cornerstone fully realized, fully functional, housing to 100 families in Portland's historically neglected East Side. It had taken 3 years to get funding, another year to navigate the permits and regulations designed to prevent exactly this kind of innovation, and 6 months of construction using methods the Vanguard had pioneered half a century ago. But it worked. Crime in the neighborhood dropped 30%, community engagement tripled, and the building operated at net zero carbon emissions while costing 40% less than conventional housing. The mayor attended the ribbon cutting, so did a dozen journalists, and so did 8 elderly architects wearing silver rings. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Sarah whispered, standing beside me. I touched the ring on my finger, my grandfather's ring, worn now with pride instead of confusion. "He knew," I said. "He knew someone would finish it." Marcus approached, looking older but lighter somehow, as if a weight he'd carried for decades had finally lifted. "The university called," he said. I raised an eyebrow. "And they want to create a Vanguard endowment, fund research, officially recognize the society's contributions to the field after everything they did? After everything we proved they did wrong," he smiled. "Sometimes institutions do learn." Eventually, I looked up at the building, at the families moving into apartments designed with care and intention, at the community garden already taking root in the central courtyard. "Tell them we'll consider it," I said, "if they're willing to put Jonathan Hayes's name on the dedication plaque. And if they agree to open their archives completely. No more secrets, no more suppressions. Done." I turned to the assembled crowd, students, activists, families, former Vanguard members, and felt something settle in my chest. Not closure, but purpose. "My grandfather once told me," I said into the microphone, "that institutions forget, but legacies don't." I held up the ring, let the light catch the Vanguard symbol. He was right. They tried to bury this work. They tried to silence the people who created it. But all they did was prove exactly why we needed it. I looked at Sarah, at Marcus, at Eleanor and David and all the others who'd refused to let go. Ideas can be buried, but they don't die. They wait for the right person, the right moment, the right fight. I smiled. And this fight? It's just beginning. The Vanguard Institute now operates in 17 cities. We don't compete with universities. We collaborate with them. We publish our research openly. We train the next generation not just in technique, but in purpose. And every student who joins us receives a silver ring engraved with a compass rose and the letter V, not as a symbol of secrecy, but as a reminder that legacy isn't about being remembered, it's about being continued. My grandfather understood that when he hid his ring for me to find. when he built that basement archive, when he refused to let a corrupt system destroy what he knew was right. He didn't need to see this day, he just needed to believe it would come. And now, every time I walk past a cornerstone building, every time a student shows me a design inspired by vanguard methods, every time someone chooses ethics over profit because they learned the history we fought to preserve, I know he's here, not gone, just continuing, through all of us.